Nora turned her paralyzed and defenseless mother-in-law into a living stepping stone for her social ascent, using her as furniture at lavish parties. But the sheikh, her husband, returned in disguise and witnessed the cruelty, preparing a punishment that would make her feel true terror. Sheikh Omar had returned to his vast estate under the cloak of night, not as the sovereign who had departed months earlier, but as a common man, with calloused hands and a face covered by a sparse, dirty beard. His silk turban had been replaced by a worn straw hat, and his luxurious robes by a gardener's overalls. No one would recognize him, and that was precisely what he wanted. He infiltrated among the new servants, a ghost in his own home, with a single purpose: to observe. Days turned into weeks, and each dawn brought a new dose of poison that Nora distilled upon his mother. Omar, bent over the rose beds his mother loved so dearly, heard muffled cries, Nora's mocking laughter echoing through the marble corridors. He saw her push his mother-in-law's wheelchair with casual disdain, leaving her in dark corners of the mansion, forgotten for hours. The mother-in-law, once a vibrant woman full of life, was now a shadow, her eyes fixed on a distant point, her dignity stolen, her voice silenced by paralysis and fear. Omar felt his heart tighten in his chest, a cold fury growing with each scene he witnessed. He clenched his fists, damp earth slipping between his fingers, but maintained the gardener's mask of indifference. The moment of truth was approaching. The night of the grand gala arrived, a spectacle of opulence that Nora had orchestrated to display her power and wealth. The mansion glittered under thousands of lights, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the melody of a string orchestra. High society guests circulated, crystal glasses in hand, while Nora, dazzling in an emerald silk gown, received compliments with a triumphant smile. Omar, disguised among the servants replenishing silver trays, watched the scene from a corner. His eyes, however, were fixed on a specific point: his mother-in-law. She was there, in the middle of the main hall, not as a guest, but as a piece of decoration. Nora had ordered his mother-in-law's wheelchair to be positioned near one of the cocktail tables, but not for her to participate. Quite the opposite. "Dear mother-in-law," Nora announced with a mellifluous voice, yet laden with scorn, to a small group of approaching guests. "Isn't it adorable how she can still be useful? Such a solid base." With an imperious gesture, Nora took a silver tray with delicate canapes, and before Omar's wide eyes and the awkward silence of some guests, placed it directly on his mother-in-law's lap. The tray was heavy, and the mother-in-law trembled slightly, her eyes welling up with humiliation. Nora, oblivious or indifferent to the suffering, smiled. "Perfect. Now, my dears, help yourselves." The guests, some shocked, others merely curious, hesitated for a moment before bending down to take appetizers from the living furniture. The mother-in-law remained motionless, her soul screaming in silence. That was the last straw. Omar felt his blood boil. The gardener's mask fell away. He threw the dishcloth he was holding to the floor and advanced, his steps firm and determined, cutting through the crowd. "Nora." His voice, deep and powerful, echoed through the hall, silencing the music and conversations. All eyes turned to him, to the dirty gardener who dared to interrupt the party. Nora turned, annoyed. "Who are you? How dare you?" "Security!" Omar stopped a few feet from her, his eyes blazing. He tore off his straw hat, revealing his dark hair and furrowed brow. With a swift movement, he pulled off the false beard, revealing his familiar face, now hardened by anger and pain. A murmur of shock rippled through the hall. Guests began to whisper, some recognizing the sheikh. Nora paled, her eyes widening in terror. Her triumphant smile dissolved, replaced by icy dread. "Omar," she whispered, her voice failing. My husband." Omar ignored her, his eyes fixed on his mother. who now looked at him with a spark of hope and disbelief. He knelt briefly beside the wheelchair, took his mother's aged hand, and kissed it with reverence. "Mother," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. Then he stood and turned to Nora, his face a mask of contained fury. "You turned her into an object, into a stepping stone, into furniture for your sick vanity." His voice was a whip. "You reveled in her pain, in her humiliation." Nora tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She trembled. "I saw everything," Omar continued, his voice growing in authority. "Every act of cruelty, every mockery. And now you will feel the weight of your own wickedness." He gestured towards the main door, where, as if on cue, a magnificent golden carriage, adorned with precious stones, was slowly pulled to the mansion's entrance by two robust guards. It was the carriage he used in his royal processions, a symbol of his power and wealth. "Take her," Omar ordered the guards, pointing at Nora. "Tie her to the carriage." Nora took a step back, terror etched on her face. "No, Omar, please, I can explain." But Omar didn't hear her. His eyes were ice. "You dragged her through the mud. Now you will drag my carriage. You will feel in your own muscles the weight of the shame you imposed on my mother, and this is just the beginning." The guards approached Nora, who let out a muffled scream, her luxurious emerald gown suddenly seeming heavy and suffocating. The sheikh watched, relentless, as his wife, once the queen of that party, was dragged out to face the terror of her own undoing and the relentless justice she herself had provoked. Nora's scream was muffled by the shocked murmurs of the guests, who now moved away, opening an improvised corridor as the guards approached her. The emerald silk gown, which moments before made her look like a queen, now seemed like a shroud, dragging her towards a fate she had never imagined. Her eyes, once filled with triumph, were wide with dread, fixed on Omar, who watched her with cutting coldness. "No, please, Omar, I didn't know you were here. I can explain. It was a misunderstanding." Nora tried to retreat, but the guards were swift and efficient. Firm hands grabbed her arms, and she felt the brute force dragging her out of the hall into the cold night. The sheikh did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on her, an icy flame of condemnation. He did not look away for a second as Nora was pulled, her slender, elegant body resisting uselessly. The mansion's luxury, the gaping guests, the silenced music, everything became a surreal backdrop for Nora's downfall. Outside, under the starry sky, the golden carriage glittered. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, encrusted with sapphires and rubies, its wheels massive and ornate, the interior lined with velvet. It was the ultimate symbol of the sheikh's power and wealth. And now, it would be the instrument of his justice. Two robust guards were already positioned beside it, holding thick leather harnesses, which seemed to have been custom-made for a beast of burden. Nora was dragged to the front of the carriage. Panic completely overwhelmed her. "What are you going to do?" "No, I am the sheikh's wife. You cannot." Omar appeared at the mansion's door, his imposing figure framed by the golden light of the hall. His voice, calm and implacable, cut through the night air. "Tie her up." The guards did not hesitate. With swift, emotionless movements, they fastened the harnesses to Nora's body. The leather straps, meant for horses, were tightened across her chest and shoulders, chafing her delicate skin beneath the thin fabric of her dress. She felt the weight of the leather, the pressure on her diaphragm, the humiliation of being treated like an animal. "Omar, please, I beg you, have mercy." Tears streamed down Nora's face, smudging her perfect makeup. She turned, desperately trying to find some trace of the man who had once loved her. But the sheikh was a stone statue, his expression unwavering. "Mercy," Omar repeated, his voice low but laden with a contained fury that made Nora tremble. "Did you have mercy on my mother?" You turned her into a stepping stone, into furniture, into an object of scorn. Now you will feel what it is like to be an object." He descended the few steps of the entrance and stopped a few feet from her, his dark eyes piercing hers. "This carriage, Nora, is heavy. It represents the weight of my wealth, of my power, and now the weight of your cruelty. You will pull it. And with each step, you will feel the shame you imposed on my mother." One of the guards handed Omar a braided leather whip. It was not for striking, but for guiding, to symbolize control. Omar held it firmly, its tip lightly brushing the ground. "Begin," Omar ordered, his voice resounding in the night. "Pull!" Nora tried. She pulled with all the strength she had, but the golden carriage remained motionless. The weight was overwhelming, the harnesses cut into her skin, and the gravel ground beneath her feet felt slippery. She felt weak, pathetic. "I can't, it's too heavy," she cried, her voice choked. Omar stepped forward, the whip in his hand. "My mother couldn't move, Nora. She was paralyzed, but you forced her to carry the weight of your vanity. Now, you will move." He made a motion with the whip, not touching her, but the sound cracked in the air, a menacing reminder. "Pull." With a groan of effort, Nora leaned forward, her muscles trembling. She pushed with her feet, struggling against the colossal weight. Slowly, with a metallic creak, the carriage began to move an inch at a time. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and the luxurious emerald gown, now crumpled and dirty, seemed to mock her former glory. The guests, who had come out to witness the spectacle, watched in stunned silence. Some averted their gaze, embarrassed. Others, however, watched with morbid curiosity, perhaps even a hint of satisfaction. Nora felt everyone's gaze upon her, the judgment, the public humiliation. The sheikh, her husband, had stripped her of everything, not just her power, but her dignity. And this, she knew with icy dread, was only the beginning of her punishment. Nora grunted, a hoarse sound barely escaping her throat. The weight was excruciating. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The leather straps of the harnesses tore at the silk of her dress and dug into her skin, leaving red, burning marks. Sweat streamed down her face, mixing with tears and smudging the makeup that once made her seem untouchable. The luxurious emerald fabric, now crumpled and dirty from the effort and the gravel path, seemed to mock her former glory. Some averted their gaze, embarrassed by the scene. Others, however, watched with morbid curiosity, perhaps even a hint of secret satisfaction, remembering Nora's arrogance. She felt everyone's gaze upon her, the judgment, the public humiliation. Omar walked beside her at a safe distance, but his presence was an even greater burden than the carriage. The whip in his hand was not used to physically assault her, but its occasional crack in the air was a constant reminder of his authority and the unfolding punishment. "Do you remember, Nora?" Omar began, his voice low but clear enough to be heard by her and the nearest guests. "How my mother begged for a glass of water, how you left her thirsty while you bathed in luxury." Nora tried to respond, but air barely reached her lungs. She pulled again, her knees almost giving way. The carriage advanced a few more inches, the creak of the wheels echoing in the night. I didn't do it out of malice, Omar," she managed to gasp, her voice choked. I was stressed." Omar stopped, and Nora was forced to stop too, the weight of the carriage pulling her back. He turned to her, his dark eyes piercing hers. "Stressed? And my mother? Paralyzed, unable to defend herself, and you used her as an object, a table support for your canapes. Do you think she wasn't stressed? Do you think she didn't feel the humiliation?" He gestured with the whip, pointing to the carriage. "This weight, Nora, is the weight of your indifference. It is the weight of every tear my mother shed. It is the weight of the dignity you stole from her." Nora felt a knot in her throat. She looked at the golden carriage, at the precious stones glittering under the moonlight, and realized the cruel irony. That was the wealth she so coveted, the symbol of status she had used to oppress her mother-in-law. Now it was her prison, her burden. "Please, Omar," she whispered, tears streaming freely. "I understand. I swear I understand. Forgive me. I'll do anything." Omar shook his head slowly. "Forgiveness. You didn't ask for forgiveness when my mother was suffering. You reveled in your power, and now you will feel what it is like to be powerless." He pointed to a more distant part of the garden, where the gravel path became slightly steep. "Come, to the lake. You have a long way to go." Dread chilled Nora's blood. The lake was a considerable distance, and the path there, with that incline, seemed like an insurmountable mountain. She looked at the guests, at their shocked and curious faces, and felt a wave of nausea. Her life of luxury, of power, of disdain had collapsed in a single night, under the gaze of everyone she had once tried to impress. With a groan of despair, Nora leaned forward again, her muscles trembling, her breath ragged. She pulled, and the golden carriage, with its opulent gleam and overwhelming weight, began to move again, dragging her towards an uncertain fate under her husband's implacable gaze and society's silent judgment. This, she knew with icy dread, was only the beginning of her punishment. Nora leaned forward again, her muscles trembling, her breath ragged. Every fiber of her body screamed in protest as she tried to move the golden carriage. The gravel path, which once seemed merely a picturesque extension of the garden, now loomed before her like an insurmountable mountain, the subtle yet relentless incline adding an excruciating layer to the already unbearable weight. The leather straps, previously just tight, now felt like blades, cutting into her skin beneath the torn fabric of her emerald dress. A hoarse groan escaped her throat, mixing with the metallic creak of the wheels. Omar walked beside her, at a distance that seemed calculated to maximize her anguish, neither so close that she could beg, nor so far that she could escape his imposing presence. The whip in his hand remained lowered, but its mere presence was a constant threat. "Do you remember, Nora?" Omar's voice was a cold whisper, but each word pierced the night air and Nora's soul. "How my mother begged for a glass of water, how you left her thirsty while you bathed in luxury and champagne." The memory hit Nora like a physical blow. She saw herself again in the kitchen, laughing with her friends, while his mother-in-law, paralyzed, watched from her wheelchair, her throat dry, her eyes pleading. Nora had ignored her, too busy flaunting her new rings. Shame and regret, feelings long buried under layers of arrogance, began to emerge, mixing with the physical pain. I didn't do it out of malice, Omar." She managed to gasp, her voice choked, almost a sob. I was stressed. I didn't think." Omar stopped abruptly, and the carriage, for a moment, pulled Nora back, almost knocking her down. He turned to her, his dark eyes piercing hers with icy intensity. "Stressed? And my mother? Do you think she didn't feel the humiliation?" He gestured with the whip, pointing to the carriage. Nora felt a knot in her throat, so tight she could barely breathe. "Please, Omar," she whispered, tears streaming freely, washing away her smudged makeup. "I understand. I swear I understand. Forgive me. I'll do anything." Omar shook his head slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of suffering. "Forgiveness, and now you will feel what it is like to be powerless." He pointed to a more distant part of the garden, where the gravel path became slightly steep, the darkness of the night swallowing the view of the lake, but not the promise of its distance. "Come, to the lake." She looked at the guests, who now formed a silent, shocked procession, some discreetly moving away, others watching with morbid curiosity, their whispers muffled by the night wind. She pulled, and the golden carriage, with its opulent gleam and overwhelming weight, began to move again. Each step was agony, each inch a painful victory. The carriage moved slowly along the winding path. The incline increased, and Nora's knees threatened to give way with each pull. Sweat drenched her body, and her dress, once a symbol of her opulence, was now torn, dirty, and clinging to her skin, a second skin of misery. Her lungs burned and her vision blurred with the effort. "Do you remember?" Omar's voice cut through the air again, this time with a tone of scorn that made Nora tremble. "When my mother asked to be taken to the garden to see the flowers, and you said you had no time, that you were busy with your own pleasures." Nora stumbled, almost falling, but the carriage pulled her forward, forcing her to maintain precarious balance. The image of his mother-in-law, her eyes fixed on the window, longing for the beauty of the garden that Nora denied her, flooded her mind. She had preferred to spend hours in beauty sessions instead of dedicating a few minutes to her mother-in-law. Guilt, once a distant whisper, now screamed in her ears. I'm so sorry," she managed to stammer, her words lost in her ragged breath. "I was horrible, I know. Please stop." Omar laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "Stop!" "My mother couldn't stop. She was trapped in her own body, and you trapped her even further in your cruelty. You made her feel useless, a burden. Now you will feel what it is like to be a burden to yourself." He made a gesture with the whip, and its tip brushed the gravel ground, creating a small trail. "Continue, Nora. Each step is a reminder. Every drop of sweat is a tear my mother shed. And the lake. The lake awaits you." The lake. The word echoed in Nora's mind like a sentence. She didn't know what awaited her there, but Omar's tone suggested that the punishment was far from over. With a last gasp of strength, she lunged forward, her eyes fixed on the ground, her world reduced to the pain in her muscles and the weight of the carriage. The guests, now more distant, seemed like ghosts in the gloom, their silhouettes observing the macabre spectacle of a queen's downfall. Nora, the once powerful and cruel Nora, was now reduced to a beast of burden, pulling the symbol of her own ruin. And the sheikh, her husband, watched, his judgment as heavy as the golden carriage. With each meter, the path seemed to grow steeper, the gravel looser, and the weight of the carriage, a living, oppressive entity, seemed to increase. The emerald dress, which once showcased her slender figure, was now torn at the shoulders, exposing reddened, raw skin beneath the leather straps. Her hair, once perfectly styled, came loose in sweaty, tangled strands, falling over her pale face, stained with tears and dirt. "Do you remember, Nora?" Omar's voice, now closer, almost a whisper in her ear, made her flinch. "How you served the most exquisite dishes to your guests, while my mother received only cold leftovers, or was completely forgotten." The image of a sumptuous banquet, with her laughing and toasting, while his mother-in-law watched from her wheelchair with an empty plate or a piece of dry bread, hit her with the force of lightning. That was the kind of subtle yet constant cruelty that corroded the soul. "No, please, no more," Nora pleaded, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. I remember everything. I was a monster. I deserve this, but please, I can't take any more." Her knees buckled and she fell to her hands and knees, the carriage stopping abruptly, pulling her back with a painful jolt. She remained there, gasping, her forehead pressed against the cold gravel, tasting the bitter blood in her mouth, a result of biting her lip hard. Omar stopped in front of her, the shadow of his imposing body covering her. He lowered the whip, and its tip lightly touched Nora's exposed shoulder. It was not a threat of physical pain, but an icy reminder of his absolute control. "You can't take any more?" "My mother couldn't take any more for years. She endured the pain, the humiliation, the hunger and thirst you imposed on her. And she didn't have the option to fall and ask to stop." He pointed forward, and Nora, with immense effort, lifted her head. Through the haze of her exhaustion and tears, she saw the lake, Its dark waters gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and a cold breeze from its surface sent a shiver down her skin. But it wasn't just the lake that awaited her. On the bank, where the water met the land, there was a small wooden platform, and upon it a figure. It was his mother-in-law. Seated in her wheelchair, wrapped in a warm shawl, she was there, watching. Her eyes, once full of pleading and pain, now held a serene, almost victorious expression. Beside her, a small silver basin filled with clear water and a soft white towel rested on a small table. The dread Nora felt was not just physical, but existential. The punishment was not only pulling the carriage, but facing the gaze of the woman she had tortured on a stage set for her own final humiliation. "Get up, Nora!" Omar's voice was a non-negotiable command. "The show is not over yet. You have one last service to render to my mother, and she is waiting." Nora, with muscles spasming and mind clouded by exhaustion, tried to stand. Every fiber of her body screamed in protest. The leather straps that bound her to the carriage seemed to cut into her skin, and the weight of the opulence she so loved now crushed her. With a choked groan, she dragged herself up, using her hands to push off the ground and her knees to propel herself. The rough gravel scraped her palms, but the physical pain was a mere echo of the humiliation that consumed her. His mother-in-law's eyes, fixed on her from the platform, were like beacons in the darkness, guiding her to her own condemnation. There was no hatred in those eyes, not even open triumph, just a calm observation that was, somehow, even more terrifying. It was the gaze of someone who had endured hell and now witnessed the downfall of her tormentor. "Come on, Nora." Omar's voice was cold and relentless. "Don't make my mother wait. She waited a long time for a little consideration, don't you think?" Omar's words hit Nora like invisible whips. Yes, she had made his mother-in-law wait for everything. For food, for attention, for a simple gesture of humanity. Now, it was she who was being forced to hurry, to bow, to serve. The irony was a bitter poison in her throat. With a monumental effort, Nora managed to stand again, swaying. She grasped the carriage handles, feeling the cold, heavy metal. The last few meters to the platform seemed to stretch infinitely. Each step was a battle against gravity and against the memory of her own atrocities. She could feel the gaze of the few guests who still remained, hidden in the shadows, watching the grotesque climax of the party. Shame was a heavy cloak, more suffocating than the physical exertion itself. Finally, with a last pull that almost made her faint, the carriage stopped a few centimeters from the platform. Nora released the handles, her arms hanging limply, trembling uncontrollably. She was gasping, her chest heaving violently, and sweat streamed in rivulets down her face and body. The emerald dress was unrecognizable, torn, dirty, and clinging to her skin. Omar descended from the carriage with an agility that brutally contrasted with Nora's exhaustion. He walked to her, stopping directly in front of her. "Now, Nora," he said, his voice low but laden with authority, "the service. My mother, in her condition, often had swollen and painful feet. Do you remember how many times she asked someone to wash them to relieve the discomfort? And you, always so busy, denied her even that small kindness." Nora raised her eyes full of dread to his mother-in-law. The elderly woman in her wheelchair looked like a statue of dignity. Her feet were visible, shod in simple slippers. But now Omar pointed to them. "Kneel, Nora," Omar ordered, and his voice brooked no questioning. "Wash my mother's feet, with the water you denied her, with the towel you did not deign to use for her, and ask forgiveness for every pain you caused." The shock was so great that Nora felt the air escape her lungs. Kneel, wash feet. It was the height of humiliation, an act of servitude she would never have imagined performing. But Omar's gaze left no doubt. She had no choice. With shaky legs, Nora fell to her knees on the wooden platform. The scent of fresh water in the silver basin was almost an insult to her thirst. She picked up the soft towel, feeling the luxurious texture she reserved only for herself. Trembling, she reached out for his mother-in-law's foot. The wrinkled, cold skin beneath her fingers was a vivid reminder of the fragility of the woman she had tormented. Hot, bitter tears streamed down her face as she dipped his mother-in-law's foot into the water. With each touch, each movement of the towel, the memories of her cruelty intensified. She remembered laughing when his mother-in-law stumbled, ignoring her pleas for help, treating her like an object. "Forgive me," Nora whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "Forgive me for everything. I'm so sorry. I was blind, cruel. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, forgive me." His mother-in-law did not say a word. Her eyes merely watched Nora, and a slight, almost imperceptible tremor passed over her lips. It was a moment of catharsis for one, and deep agony for the other. Nora continued to wash the feet, feeling every drop of water, every fiber of the towel, as a weight on her conscience. She was no longer the queen of the mansion, but a servant, humiliated, stripped of everything, confronting the truth of her own wickedness. When she finished, she dried his mother-in-law's feet with the towel, her eyes swollen and red. She did not dare to look up at the elderly woman. Omar approached again. "A good start, Nora," he said, his voice still emotionless. "But the path to redemption is long and arduous, and you still have much to learn about the true meaning of service and respect. This is just the first step." He gestured towards the lake, whose dark waters seemed to call to her. "Get up. The night is not over yet, and the lake has more to offer you than just water to wash feet." Omar's words echoed in the darkness, and Nora, still kneeling, felt a chill that didn't come solely from the night breeze. She raised her tear-filled eyes to him, then to the lake, whose waters seemed like a bottomless abyss under the pale moonlight. What more could he want? What more could she endure? With a groan of effort, Nora pushed herself up, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Every muscle ached, every joint protested. The emerald dress, now a mass of torn and soiled fabric, clung to her skin, damp with sweat and tears. She was exhausted, humiliated, and the dread of the unknown was almost as overwhelming as the physical pain. Omar stepped forward, his imposing figure casting a long, menacing shadow over her. He pointed to the water. "My mother," he began, his voice low and controlled, "had a small medallion. A gift from my father before his death, a simple silver piece with a small emerald inlaid. She wore it every day until you deemed it worthless and threw it away. I found it once near the fountain and returned it to her, but one day it disappeared again. She cried for it, Nora. Do you remember?" Nora felt her blood run cold. The medallion. Yes, she remembered. In a fit of rage at seeing his mother-in-law attached to something so insignificant, she had ripped it from the old woman's neck and, with a gesture of disdain, thrown it somewhere. She didn't care where it went. Now, the truth hit her with brutal force. I don't know where it is," she whispered, her voice choked. "Oh, I know," Omar replied, a cold glint in his eyes. "It was found on the lake's edge, near where you used to sit to drink your afternoon tea, while my mother languished in her room. The current carried it into deeper waters, but it's still there, Nora, and you will bring it back." The shock left her breathless. Enter the lake, in that dark, cold water. Fear mingled with shame. She, Nora, the queen of parties, the woman who detested anything that wasn't luxury and comfort, would be forced to dive into the icy waters to retrieve an object she herself had scorned. "But it's too deep," she stammered, her gaze fixed on the dark surface. "I can't see anything." "You will search," Omar retorted, without a shred of compassion. "Just as my mother searched for a little warmth, a little food, A little dignity, you will feel the cold, the darkness, the uncertainty, and you will not come out until you find it." He gestured to his mother-in-law, who watched in silence, her eyes fixed on Nora. "My mother is waiting. She has waited years for this medallion. Don't make her wait any longer." His mother-in-law, wrapped in her shawl, looked like a silent judge. There was no malice in her gaze, only a serene expectation that was somehow more oppressive than any anger. With her heart pounding erratically in her chest, Nora staggered to the edge of the platform. The water seemed like an icy abyss, an invitation to oblivion. She hesitated for a moment, but Omar's relentless gaze forced her to act. With a trembling sigh, she stepped into the water. The shock of the cold was immediate and brutal. The icy water rose up her legs, then her waist, and she felt a shiver run through her entire body. Her soaked dress weighed like lead, hindering her movements. With each step, the muddy, slippery bottom of the lake made her stumble, and the cold seemed to penetrate her bones. "Search, Nora!" Omar's voice came from the bank, a command that cut through the cold air. "Search for what you threw away. Feel what it is like to lose something precious through your own cruelty." Nora plunged her hands into the dark water, fumbling the bottom with numb fingers. The darkness was almost total, and she couldn't see anything. With each movement, the water stirred, and the cold seemed to intensify. Tears mixed with the lake water on her face, and she no longer knew if she was crying or if it was just the cold. Memories of her luxurious life, her extravagant parties, her indifference towards his mother-in-law flooded her mind. She had thrown away the medallion, just as she had thrown away the dignity and happiness of an elderly woman. Now she was there, in the midst of darkness and cold, searching for a piece of metal that represented everything she had destroyed. Her fingers touched something hard and cold, a small object. With a desperate effort, she grabbed it, pulling it out of the water. It was the medallion. Small, simple, but now, in her trembling hands, it seemed the most valuable treasure in the world. The small emerald gleamed faintly under the moonlight. With the medallion clutched in her hand, Nora turned, her teeth chattering from the cold, her lips blue. She looked at Omar, then at his mother-in-law, who now had a different glint in her eyes. It was a glint of recognition, perhaps even of an ancient pain resurfacing. "You found it," Omar said, his voice still emotionless. "Now bring it to my mother, and then you will have one last task before the night ends." Trembling, Nora staggered out of the water, her emerald dress dripping and clinging to her body. Each step was a struggle against the cold and exhaustion. She approached his mother-in-law, extending the hand that held the medallion. His mother-in-law, with a slow and careful movement, extended her own wrinkled hand. Her fingers touched the small silver object, and an almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips. Her eyes, which once seemed empty, now shone with contained emotion. She looked at the medallion, then at Nora, and a slight smile, tinged with melancholy, appeared on her face. It was not a smile of triumph, but of profound relief, as if a weight of years had finally been lifted. "Forgive me," Nora whispered again, tears mixing with the lake water on her face. "Please forgive me. I was horrible." His mother-in-law did not respond with words, but her eyes met Nora's, and for a brief instant, Nora felt a pang of something that could be compassion, or perhaps just the exhaustion of a soul that had endured too much. The elderly woman clutched the medallion in her hand, as if fearing to lose it again. Omar observed the scene in silence, his eyes fixed on Nora. When his mother-in-law put away the medallion, he stepped forward. "My mother is tired," he said, his voice cutting through the cold air. "She spent years in discomfort, in a cold room, without the attention she deserved. You, Nora, who lived in luxury and despised her needs, Now we'll have the chance to make amends for some of that. Nora raised her eyes, dread renewed. What? What else? You will take her to her chambers, Omar ordered, pointing to the mansion that loomed imposingly in the darkness. You will prepare her for rest. You will ensure she is comfortable, that she has everything she needs for a peaceful night, exactly as she should have had all these years, and as you denied her. The shock was almost as great as the cold that consumed her. Take his mother-in-law to her room, prepare her for sleep. It was an act of intimacy and care she had never offered, a service she considered beneath her dignity, but Omar's voice left no room for refusal. With a groan of exhaustion, Nora positioned herself behind the wheelchair. Her hands, still numb from the cold, grasped the handles. She pushed his mother-in-law, feeling the weight of the chair and the elderly woman, a weight that also seemed to carry the burden of her own guilt. Every meter to the mansion was torture. The stone floor was uneven, and her shaky legs threatened to give way with each step. As they entered the mansion, the contrast with the outside was stark. The soft lighting and warmth of the interior seemed an insult to her condition. Nora pushed the chair down the silent corridor, passing through rooms where she once reigned at opulent parties. Now the mansion seemed like a tomb of her former glories. Finally, they reached his mother-in-law's room. It was a simple but clean room with a made-up bed and a small bedside table. Omar followed her, stopping at the door, observing Nora's every move. "Put her to bed," Omar instructed, his voice a whisper that echoed in the room. "Take off her shoes, adjust the pillows, offer her water, and make sure she is warm." With trembling hands, Nora knelt again beside the wheelchair. She removed his mother-in-law's slippers, feeling the cold, soft skin. With an effort, she helped the elderly woman stand and carefully lay her on the bed. His mother-in-law, in silence, allowed Nora to move her, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Nora adjusted the pillows, trying to make them soft and inviting. She took a glass of water from the bedside table and offered it to his mother-in-law, who drank slowly, her eyes meeting Nora's for an instant. Finally, Nora took a soft blanket and spread it over his mother-in-law, covering her with a care she had never shown. The silence in the room was heavy, filled only by his mother-in-law's gentle breathing and Nora's suppressed sobs. She was there, serving the woman she had so humiliated, feeling each gesture like a stab in her own soul. The image of his mother-in-law, fragile and silent, was a mirror of her own cruelty. Omar approached the bed, his eyes fixed on his mother. He smoothed a strand of hair that fell across her face, a gesture of tenderness that contrasted with the coldness of his orders to Nora. He then turned to Nora, who was still kneeling beside the bed, drenched and exhausted. "This is the first night of many." "Nora," he said, his voice now a little softer but still laden with unquestionable authority, "may you learn the true meaning of care and compassion. May you feel on your skin the weight of every neglect, every humiliation you imposed. The path to redemption is long, and you have only just begun to walk it." Nora did not respond. She merely lowered her head, tears streaming freely. The night was not over yet, but the darkness in her soul seemed deeper than the night itself. She had been stripped of everything, and now she confronted herself, the cruel woman she had become, and the long and arduous journey that awaited her. Omar watched Nora, still kneeling, with a gaze that showed no pity but an iron determination. He knew that physical humiliation was only the beginning. The true punishment lay in confronting her own soul and the complete inversion of her world. "Get up, Nora," he commanded, his voice low but laden with an authority that made her tremble. "You have completed the first part. Now, leave." Nora, with visible effort, managed to rise. Her legs trembled and her wet dress clung to her body, making every movement a struggle. She cast a glance at his mother-in-law, who now seemed to sleep serenely, relieved of the weight of her presence. The image of the elderly woman, finally at peace, was a painful reminder of the torment she herself had caused. Where? Where should I go? Nora asked, her voice hoarse from crying and the cold. Omar pointed to the bedroom door, then to the dark corridor. You will not return to your chambers, Nora. Those days of luxury and indulgence are over. You will now live in a place that reflects the simplicity and helplessness you imposed on my mother. Nora's heart leaped. She knew she couldn't expect to return to her opulent suite, but the uncertainty of what would come next was an even greater terror. Omar left his mother-in-law's room, and Nora followed him, stumbling. He led her down a side corridor, one she rarely used, reserved for lower-ranking staff. Each step echoed in the mansion's silence, a reminder that the festivities had ceased, and with them, her reign. Finally, Omar stopped before a simple, dark, unadorned wooden door at the end of a cold, dimly lit corridor. He opened the door. The room was small, Spartan. There was a single bed, with a thin mattress, a small wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the service courtyard, far from the lush gardens she so loved. There were no Persian rugs, no silks, no scent of fresh flowers that always filled her old quarters. The air was cold and damp. "This will be your new home, Nora," Omar declared, his voice devoid of emotion. "Here, you will have time to reflect, to feel what deprivation is, what loneliness is. There are no luxuries, no mirrors for your vanity, only the naked, raw reality you so despised." Nora looked at the room, then at Omar, her eyes wide with horror. But there's no heating. There isn't even a private bathroom." "Exactly," Omar replied, a faint, bitter smile playing on his lips. "You will feel the cold my mother felt. You will use the facilities she used, which you considered unworthy of your presence. Tomorrow at dawn, you will have new tasks, tasks that will require more than just your hands. They will require your soul." He stepped back, his eyes fixed on hers. "Sleep well, Nora. Or try to. May the weight of your actions be your only blanket tonight." With those words, Omar closed the door, leaving Nora alone in the darkness and cold. She stood in the middle of the room, her body trembling uncontrollably. Physical and emotional exhaustion hit her like a wave. She threw herself onto the bed, feeling the hard mattress and thin covers. The smell of mold and dust was a stark contrast to the scent of lavender and roses she used to inhale. Tears returned, but this time they were different. They were not just tears of fear or self-pity, but of a terrible understanding. She had been stripped of everything, her power, her wealth, her comfort, her very identity. The mansion, which was once her stage, was now her prison. Nora curled up under the covers, the cold penetrating her bones. Every sound of the night, every shadow on the wall, seemed a reminder of her new reality. She tried to close her eyes, but the images of his mother-in-law, fragile and silent, mingled with those of Omar, implacable and just. The night would be long, and the darkness in her soul, which Omar had promised she would confront, seemed only to have begun to reveal itself. The path to redemption was long, and Nora, for the first time in her life, felt the true weight of every step. The cold was excruciating. It wasn't the elegant chill of a gala night, fought off with furs and lit fireplaces, but a damp, penetrating cold that seemed to suck the life from her bones. Nora pulled the thin covers up to her chin, but they offered little protection against the icy air seeping in through the poorly sealed window. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not only from the cold, but from a terror that consumed her from within. She was accustomed to Egyptian silk sheets, to soft mattresses that enveloped her like an embrace. Now, the straw mattress felt like it was made of stones, each protrusion digging into her back. The pillow, thin and lifeless, offered no comfort to her throbbing head. The smell of mold and dampness was suffocating. a brutal contrast to the aromas of lavender and jasmine that perfumed her former quarters. "This will be your new home, Nora," Omar's voice echoed in her mind, cold and devoid of any emotion. "To feel what deprivation is, what loneliness is." Deprivation, loneliness. Words she had always associated with the weak, the disadvantaged, never with herself. Nora, the queen of the mansion, the woman who controlled everything and everyone, was now reduced to this, a cell, a cold, forgotten cubicle. Images of his mother-in-law began to haunt her. The elderly woman seated in her wheelchair, her eyes devoid of hope, as Nora used her as a table support, as living furniture. The memory of the terror in his mother-in-law's eyes when Nora forced her to pull the golden carriage, the same terror that now paralyzed her. Every humiliation, every cruel word, every gesture of contempt she had inflicted now returned to her, amplified in a deafening echo of guilt. She remembered the parties, the easy laughter, the bubbling champagne, the crystal glasses, the fine porcelain dishes, the jewels that adorned her neck and wrists. All of it dissolved like smoke. Her wealth, her power, her beauty, all were illusions. Omar had stripped her soul bare, exposing the ugliness she tried to hide beneath a layer of luxury. "You will use the facilities she used, which you considered unworthy of your presence." Omar's words were a silent torture. She felt the cold, yes, but it was more than physical. It was the cold of loneliness, of abandonment, of the loss of everything she valued. The shared bathroom, the rudimentary facilities, the idea disgusted her, but Omar's terror was greater than any disgust. Nora turned on her side, trying to find a less painful position, but the mattress seemed to refuse to yield. Her eyes opened in the darkness, searching for any trace of light, but there were only shadows dancing on the walls, transforming into accusing faces. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. She had despised his mother-in-law for her weakness, for her dependence. Now, she was the weak one, the dependent one, at the mercy of Omar, the man she had betrayed and humiliated. The inversion of roles was complete, and the irony was a bitter poison in her mouth. Time dragged on. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour an eternity. She tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat. What God could forgive a creature as cruel as she? Omar's promise of new tasks at dawn hung over her like a death sentence. What would he make her do? Clean? Cook? Serve? The same tasks she delegated with a snap of her fingers would now be her reality. The thought of having to bow, of having to obey, was almost as terrifying as the deprivation itself. Nora closed her eyes tightly, wishing the night would end, that all of it was just a nightmare. But the reality of the hard mattress, the biting cold, and the smell of mold was undeniable. She was trapped, not just in that room, but in the consequences of her own actions. Redemption, if it existed, seemed an endless and painful path, and Nora knew, with an icy certainty, that she was only on the first step. The first ray of pale, cold sunlight crept through the dusty window, cutting through the darkness of the cubicle. For Nora, it was not the dawn of a new day, but the arrival of a sentence. Her eyes, swollen and red from the sleepless night, fixed on the sliver of light which seemed to mock her misery. Her body ached, every muscle protesting against the hardness of the mattress and the dampness that seeped into her bones. The smell of mold was now a part of her, impregnated in her fine clothes and once perfumed hair. A metallic clang at the door made her jump. The heavy bolt was unlocked, and the door opened with a mournful creak, revealing the imposing silhouette of one of Omar's guards. He said not a word, merely gestured with his head, indicating she should leave. The terror that had accompanied her through the night intensified. Nora rose with difficulty, her legs shaky. The silk dress she had worn the night before, now crumpled and dirty, was a cruel reminder of her downfall. She followed the guard through corridors she never knew existed in the mansion, dark, narrow service passages, far from the opulent halls she once dominated. The air was heavy with the smell of grease, dust, and sweat. They stopped before a solid wooden door, which led to what appeared to be the laundry room. The humid heat and dense steam emanating from within hit her like a punch. Robust women, with red faces and strong arms, scrubbed piles of clothes in large stone tubs, the sound of water and soap filling the air. Omar was there, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze as cold as the night Nora had just endured. His eyes met hers, and Nora felt a shiver run down her spine. "Good morning, Nora," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I hope you rested well. Today, you will have the opportunity to appreciate the arduous work you always despised." He gestured to a pile of dirty, crumpled and stained clothes beside an empty tub. "Your first task, wash everything by hand. And don't worry, there's no perfumed soap or hot water for you. Use what the others use." Nora looked at the pile of clothes with disgust. They were gardener's uniforms, cleaning rags, stained sheets. The smell was strong, a mixture of sweat, earth, and something indefinable that made her stomach churn. I don't know how to do this," she stammered, her voice choked. Omar stepped forward, his presence imposing. "You will learn, just as my mother learned to manage without the help you denied her. You will feel the pain in your hands, the fatigue in your arms, the humiliation of having to scrub away the dirt of others." He pointed to one of the women. "She will instruct you, and do not try to flee or refuse. The consequences will be more severe." The woman Omar indicated. An old lady with a wrinkled face and tired eyes approached. She seemed to show no pity, only a silent resignation. "Come, madam," she said, her voice hoarse. "There's no time to waste. The laundry doesn't wash itself." Nora felt tears well up, but swallowed them. She wouldn't give Omar the satisfaction of seeing her cry. With trembling hands, she approached the stone tub. The cold, dirty water felt like an electric shock on her delicate skin. She picked up the first item, a heavy, grimy gardener's uniform, and tried to imitate the movements of the other women, scrubbing it against the rough stone surface. With each movement, her wrists ached. Her fingers became red and wrinkled. The soap, a rustic, unscented block, was ineffective against the ingrained dirt. She looked at her hands, once immaculate, adorned with diamond rings, now plunged into filth. The irony was a poison that burned in her throat. Hours dragged on, each minute a physical and emotional torture. The steam suffocated her, the smell nauseated her, and the incessant work drained her last strength. She felt an exhaustion she never imagined possible, a fatigue that went beyond the body, reaching her soul. By the end of the morning, when her back ached and her hands were raw, Nora looked at the pile of clothes that still remained. It was almost as large as the one she had started. Omar had disappeared, but his presence still hung over her, an implacable shadow. Nora knelt, her body trembling, and rested her head against the cold tub. Images of his mother-in-law, seated in her wheelchair, her eyes empty, returned with frightening clarity. She had made his mother-in-law feel useless, a burden. Now she was the useless one, the weak one, the one who couldn't even wash a piece of clothing. The humiliation was profound, but for the first time, it wasn't just anger or terror she felt. There was a pang of something more, a glimpse of the reality she had denied for so long. The weight of the first step was excruciating, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of a path she needed to walk. Nora remained kneeling, her head resting against the cold tub, her body trembling with exhaustion and a new kind of dread. It wasn't the dread of physical punishment that dominated her, but the dread of truth. The truth that she had been blind, cruel, and above all, empty. Images of his mother-in-law, once merely accusing ghosts, now materialized with painful clarity. She saw his mother-in-law's eyes, not just empty, but filled with a pain Nora had never deigned to acknowledge. She saw weakness not as a flaw, but as a condition imposed by illness and amplified by her own wickedness. The smell of sweat and rustic soap, which once nauseated her, now seemed to permeate her own skin, a constant reminder of her new reality. Her hands, once soft and immaculate, were raw, her fingers swollen and aching. Every fiber of her being cried out for rest, for a hot bath, for silk sheets. But these were memories of a distant past, of a life she had destroyed with her own hands. The old lady with the wrinkled face, who had instructed her, approached again. "That's all for today, madam," she said, her voice still hoarse, but with a tone Nora perceived as strange compassion, or perhaps a silent understanding. "Tomorrow there's more. There's always more." Nora rose with difficulty, every muscle protesting. The guard was there, waiting. He led her back through the dark corridors, the silence broken only by the echo of her own footsteps and the frantic beating of her heart. Upon reaching the cell, the cold air and the smell of mold greeted her like an old acquaintance. The door closed with a dull thud, and the heavy bolt was engaged, sealing her once again in her prison of darkness and reflection. She threw herself onto the hard mattress, not caring about the dust or dampness. Her body ached, but the physical pain was merely a veil for the deeper pain that was beginning to corrode her soul. Omar was not merely seeking revenge. He was seeking transformation. He wanted her to feel, to understand, to break, and perhaps to rebuild herself. "You will use the facilities she used, which you considered unworthy of your presence." Omar's words returned, not as a torture, but as a prophecy being fulfilled with every passing minute. She felt the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion. She felt the humiliation of being treated as the lowest of servants, of having to obey, of having to bow. Shadows danced on the walls, and this time they were not just accusing faces. They were faces of people she had despised, of servants she had mistreated, of his own mother-in-law, whose suffering she had turned into a spectacle. With each image, a pang of remorse, a glimpse of the monstrosity she had become. Nora closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. The exhaustion was immense, but her mind was in turmoil. She could no longer escape the truth. There was no luxury to hide her ugliness, no power to silence her conscience. She was naked, exposed, and for the first time in a long time she felt small, insignificant. The path to redemption, if it existed, would be long and painful. It would not be a path of easy forgiveness, but of arduous labor, of forced humility, of a slow and excruciating reconstruction of herself. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, what new tasks Omar would impose on her, but one thing was certain. The Nora of before, the cruel and vain queen, had died in the laundry room, amidst the dirty water and rustic soap. And what would rise from her ashes was still a question to be answered by the Sheikh's implacable justice, and the time she would spend feeling on her skin the weight of her own cruelty. The first step had been taken, and the echo of her pain was merely the prelude to a journey that had just begun.